In the autumn of 1944, three American destroyers left Philadelphia's Naval Shipyard and were torpedoed by German U-boats within 48 hours. The Navy blamed it on bad luck. FBI Special Agent Thomas Crawford blamed it on a Nazi spy network operating inside the shipyard itself. 2 weeks after he started investigating, Crawford vanished. His own bureau covered it up. The question that haunted them for decades was simple: did the spy network kill him, or did someone on the inside? If you're drawn to cases where patriotism and betrayal blur into a deadly game, make sure you're subscribed, because this story will take you into the shadows of America's greatest war, where the enemy wasn't just overseas. October in Philadelphia carries a particular kind of cold that locals recognize immediately. It's not the brutal, bone-shattering freeze of January, but a damp, creeping chill that works its way through wool coats and settles into your chest like a warning. In 1944, the autumn arrived with a vengeance, bringing with it a fog that rolled off the Delaware River each morning, thick enough to taste the coal smoke and industrial soot that hung in the air like a permanent cloud over the shipyards. The war in Europe was entering what everyone hoped would be its final year, but hope was a dangerous commodity in a city that built the weapons of war. Philadelphia's Naval Shipyard operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, its massive cranes silhouetted against the night sky like steel dinosaurs. The sound of riveting guns echoed across South Philadelphia at all hours, a metallic percussion that never stopped, that invaded dreams and made sleep a luxury few could afford. Special Agent Thomas Crawford of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been assigned to the Philadelphia office for 3 years. He was 34 years old, though the war had aged him in ways that photographs couldn't capture. He had dark hair that he kept meticulously combed, a habit from his days in the Marines before he joined the Bureau. His colleagues described him as methodical, patient, and possessing an almost supernatural ability to remember details that others overlooked. He spoke German fluently, a skill that made him invaluable in counterintelligence work. Crawford lived in a modest row house on Fitzwater Street with his wife Margaret and their 7-year-old daughter Claire. The house was identical to every other house on the block, red brick with white marble steps that Margaret scrubbed every Saturday morning, a Philadelphia tradition that marked respectability and pride. The neighborhood was predominantly Irish and Italian, working-class families whose sons were fighting in France and whose daughters worked in the war plants. Everyone knew everyone's business, which made Crawford's work both easier and more complicated. The first destroyer, USS Benson, left Philadelphia on September 28, 1944. She was a Fletcher-class destroyer, 376 feet of steel and armament, freshly overhauled and recommissioned after taking damage in the Mediterranean. Her crew of 273 men were a mix of veterans and fresh recruits, most of them barely old enough to vote. She sailed down the Delaware River on a gray Thursday morning, bound for Norfolk and then the Atlantic convoy routes. 41 hours later, at 0347 hours on September 30th, USS Benson was struck by 2 torpedoes from U-boat 482, approximately 200 miles east of Cape May, New Jersey. She went down in 11 minutes. Only 47 men survived. The Navy's official report would later state that the destroyer had been operating in known U-boat waters and had failed to execute proper zigzag protocols. The second destroyer, USS Harlan, departed Philadelphia on October 2nd. She suffered the same fate on October 4th, torpedoed by U-boat 234 in nearly the same coordinates. This time, only 29 men made it to the lifeboats before she rolled and sank. The Navy began asking questions, but quietly, internally, in the careful language of men who understood that panic was as dangerous as the enemy. The third destroyer, USS McKinley, left port on October 7th with a full escort and explicit orders to maintain radio silence and execute randomized evasion patterns. She was torpedoed on October 9th by U-boat 482 again, the same submarine that had sunk the Benson. 318 men went down with her in the cold Atlantic darkness. 3 destroyers in less than 2 weeks, all from the same shipyard, all sunk in the same general area by U-boats that seemed to know exactly where they would be and when. The Navy called it a tragic coincidence. The Office of Naval Intelligence called it a statistical anomaly. Special Agent Thomas Crawford called it what it was: a leak. On October 10th, Crawford received orders from FBI headquarters in Washington to investigate possible sabotage or intelligence compromise at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The directive came directly from the desk of Assistant Director Edward Tam, head of the Bureau's Domestic Intelligence Division. The memo was marked most secret and instructed Crawford to operate under deepest cover, trusting no one outside the Bureau, including Naval Intelligence, and especially including the Philadelphia Police Department. Crawford began his investigation the way he always did, by watching and listening. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard was a world unto itself, covering over 1,000 acres along the Delaware River, employing more than 40,000 people at its wartime peak. It was a city within a city, with its own police force, its own fire department, its own hierarchy of power that had nothing to do with the streets outside its gates. Security at the shipyard was supposed to be airtight. Every worker wore a photo identification badge, color-coded by clearance level. Armed Marine guards checked credentials at each gate. Restricted areas required special passes that were changed weekly. But Crawford understood something that the Navy seemed to have forgotten. Security measures only work if the people enforcing them can't be compromised. He started by examining the personnel files of every worker who had access to the 3 doomed destroyers during their refit and recommissioning. This meant pulling files on over 3,000 individuals, from the admirals who signed the commissioning orders to the welders who reinforced the hull plates. The work was tedious, painstaking, and had to be done without raising suspicion. Crawford set up his operation in a forgotten office in the Federal Building on 9th and Market Street, 3 blocks from Independence Hall. The office had been used for storing old tax records and smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke from decades past. He requisitioned a filing cabinet, a telephone that he suspected was monitored, and a desk lamp that flickered whenever a trolley passed outside. He told his wife he was working on fraud cases and might be home late for the next few weeks. The personnel files revealed patterns that made Crawford's instincts sharpen. Several workers assigned to all 3 destroyers had German surnames: Schneider, Müller, Hoffman, Becker. In any other context, this would mean nothing. Philadelphia had one of the largest German-American populations in the country, over 200,000 people whose ancestors had emigrated in the 1800s. Most were loyal Americans who bought war bonds and sent their sons to fight Hitler, but some weren't. Crawford knew that before the war, Philadelphia had been home to multiple chapters of the German-American Bund, a pro-Nazi organization that held rallies, published propaganda newspapers, and operated youth camps where children learned to salute the swastika. The FBI had infiltrated these groups in the late 1930s, and again after Pearl Harbor. Most Bund members had been arrested or intimidated into silence by 1942, but Crawford suspected that the most dangerous ones, the true believers, had simply gone deeper underground. He began surveillance on October 12th, starting with a shipyard electrician named Otto Becker. Becker was 53 years old, a naturalized citizen who had emigrated from Hamburg in 1923. His file showed that he had worked at the shipyard since 1928, had never missed a day of work, and had received 3 commendations for his electrical expertise. He had also been a member of the Bund until it was dissolved, though he claimed in his loyalty oath to have joined only for social reasons. Crawford followed Becker for 3 days, watching his routines with the patience of a man who understood that espionage was rarely dramatic. Becker lived in a row house in Kensington, a neighborhood of Polish and German immigrants, where every block had at least 3 churches and twice as many bars. He walked to work, carried his lunch in a metal pail, smoked Lucky Strikes on his breaks, and went home at exactly 5:37 every evening. On the 4th day, October 16th, Becker deviated from his pattern. Instead of going home, he took the Market Frankfurt elevated train west into Center City. Crawford followed, 3 cars behind, watching through the grimy windows as the city scrolled past in a blur of brick and steel. Becker got off at 15th Street Station and walked south into Rittenhouse Square, one of Philadelphia's most affluent neighborhoods, where old money lived in townhouses behind wrought iron gates. The contrast was jarring. Becker, in his grease-stained work clothes and cloth cap, walked through streets where men wore tailored suits and women carried shopping bags from Wanamaker's department store. He seemed to know exactly where he was going, moving with purpose but not haste, his eyes scanning the street in a way that Crawford recognized, the careful awareness of someone who had been trained in counter-surveillance. Becker stopped at a church, St. Mark's Episcopal, a Gothic revival structure built in the 1850s with a tall bell tower that dominated the square. He didn't go inside. Instead, he walked around to the rear of the building, into a small cemetery where old Philadelphia families had been buried for generations. Crawford waited across the street, partially hidden behind a parked delivery truck, watching. Becker approached a particular gravestone, a weathered marble angel marking the grave of someone named Aldrich, dead since 1887. He knelt as if in prayer, but his hands moved to the base of the stone. Crawford couldn't see exactly what he did, but the motion was brief and practiced. Becker stood, looked around once more, and walked away. This was a dead drop. Crawford had seen them before in training and in the field. The technique was simple and nearly impossible to catch without direct observation. Information written on thin paper, rolled tight, and hidden in a prearranged location where another agent could retrieve it later, without any direct contact between the parties. It was a method favored by Soviet intelligence, and Crawford knew by the Abwehr, German military intelligence. Crawford waited until Becker was out of sight, then approached the grave. He examined the angel monument carefully, running his fingers along its base, and found what he was looking for. A small gap between the marble base and the brick foundation, deliberately widened, just large enough to slip a rolled piece of paper through. The drop was empty. Becker had made a deposit, not a pickup. Crawford made a decision that would alter everything that followed. He didn't retrieve whatever Becker had left. Instead, he decided to watch and wait, to see who came to collect it. This was the standard protocol in counterintelligence. Follow the chain, identify all the players before making arrests. But it was also dangerous, because every hour that intelligence remained in enemy hands was an hour it could be transmitted to Berlin. He found a position in the church cemetery that offered a clear view of the gravestone while keeping him hidden behind a mausoleum. The October afternoon faded into evening, and the temperature dropped. Crawford wore a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low, looking like any other mourner visiting the dead. He smoked cigarettes to stay warm, cupping them in his hand so the ember wouldn't give away his position. At 6:47 p.m., just as the streetlights began to flicker on, a man approached the cemetery. He was tall and well-dressed, wearing an expensive cashmere overcoat and carrying a leather briefcase. His hair was silver, his face distinguished, perhaps 60 years old. He walked with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, someone whose presence commanded respect. Crawford recognized him immediately, and the recognition sent ice through his veins. The man was Harrison Aldrich III, one of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens, a senior executive at the Cramp Shipbuilding Company, one of the private contractors that built vessels for the Navy. His family name was on half the buildings in Center City. His face appeared regularly in the society pages of the Philadelphia Inquirer. He served on the board of the Union League, the Art Museum, and the Chamber of Commerce. Aldrich approached the grave, his own family's monument, Crawford now realized, with the casual ease of someone who belonged there. He knelt, reached into the gap at the base of the angel, and retrieved a small roll of paper. He slipped it into his coat pocket without examining it, stood, and walked away. Crawford let him go. He had to. Aldrich was too prominent, too connected to arrest without ironclad evidence. But now Crawford understood the shape of what he was facing. This wasn't a crude sabotage ring of disgruntled workers. This was something far more sophisticated. a spy network that extended from the factory floor to the executive suites, from immigrant neighborhoods to the highest levels of Philadelphia society. Over the next 2 days, Crawford worked with an intensity that his wife would later describe as obsessive. He pulled financial records, shipping manifests, production schedules, anything that would help him understand what information was being passed and how it was reaching the U-boats. He requested surveillance files on Aldrich from FBI headquarters, only to be told that Aldrich was above suspicion, that his family had built clipper ships in the 1800s and destroyers in the last war, that questioning his loyalty was politically impossible. Crawford ignored the warning. He documented everything: Becker's routine, the dead drop location, Aldrich's pickup. He photographed the cemetery from multiple angles, noting the sight lines and timing. He began building a case file that he intended to take directly to J. Edgar Hoover himself if necessary. On October 18th, Crawford discovered something that made the investigation exponentially more dangerous. While examining the sailing orders for the 3 destroyed vessels, he noticed something that should have been impossible. Each ship's exact departure date, route, and radio call signs had been changed at the last minute, updated in the 48 hours before they left port. These changes were classified at the highest level, known only to a handful of naval intelligence officers and shipyard executives. Yet the U-boats had found each destroyer with uncanny precision, as if they'd been given not just general intelligence but specific coordinates and timetables. This suggested that the leak wasn't just accessing general shipyard information, it had penetrated naval intelligence itself, or someone in naval intelligence was part of the network. Crawford drafted a report that evening, outlining his findings and requesting immediate authorization to expand the investigation. He wrote it by hand, in the office with the flickering lamp, because he no longer trusted typewriters or secretaries or anyone else who might see the words. The report was 7 pages long, detailing the surveillance of Becker, the dead drop, Aldrich's involvement, and the timing analysis of the ship's sinkings. He sealed the report in an envelope and planned to deliver it personally to his superior, Special Agent in charge Walter Morrison. First thing the following morning. Morrison was a 20-year Bureau veteran, a man Crawford trusted absolutely. But Crawford made one mistake, a small one that would prove fatal. He mentioned to his wife that he'd cracked something big, that by the end of the week this would be over and he could finally sleep. Margaret Crawford told this to a neighbor, Mrs. Delgado, while hanging laundry the next morning. Mrs. Delgado mentioned it to her sister. Her sister mentioned it to her husband, who worked as a clerk in the shipyard administrative offices. By noon on October 19th, the information had traveled through the invisible network of neighborhood gossip that was faster and more efficient than any intelligence service. That evening, Crawford left the federal building at 7:30 p.m., later than usual. He walked to Reading Terminal Station, intending to catch the elevated train home. The station was crowded with the evening rush: war workers, sailors on leave, women carrying shopping bags, children running between the legs of tired adults. The cavernous terminal smelled of diesel fuel and roasted peanuts, and the sweat of humanity packed too close together. Crawford never made it to the platform. Witnesses would later report seeing a man in a dark coat, matching Crawford's description, walking toward the southbound tracks. One witness, a newsboy named Jimmy Delacroix, remembered seeing the man stop to light a cigarette near the entrance to the men's washroom. Another witness, a woman named Rose Kowalski, thought she saw the same man speaking briefly with another man, taller and wearing a fedora, though she couldn't be certain it was Crawford because she'd only seen him from behind. After that, nothing. Thomas Crawford simply ceased to exist. He didn't board the train. He didn't return to his office. He didn't call his wife. He vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. Margaret Crawford called the FBI field office at 10 p.m., when her husband still hadn't come home. Special Agent in charge Morrison took the call personally, and something in his voice made Margaret's fear crystallize into certainty that this was not a simple case of a missed train or a forgotten errand. Morrison arrived at the Crawford house within the hour, accompanied by 2 other agents, and asked Margaret the kinds of questions that made clear they were treating this as a security matter, not a missing person case. Did Thomas mention any specific names recently? Had anyone unusual contacted him? Had he seemed worried or frightened? Had he mentioned where he kept his case files? Margaret answered as best she could, her voice steady despite the terror building in her chest. Yes, Thomas had seemed distracted lately. No, he hadn't mentioned being afraid. Yes, he'd been working late, but he always worked late. The case files were in his office, she assumed. Morrison and his team went immediately to Crawford's office in the federal building. What they found there would haunt them for decades. Nothing. The office had been cleaned out. The filing cabinet was empty. The desk drawers contained only pencils and paper clips. The 7-page report Crawford had written was gone. The Philadelphia Police Department was notified as a courtesy, but was told in no uncertain terms to stay out of the investigation. This was a federal matter, a security issue that superseded local jurisdiction. The PPD, stretched thin by wartime manpower shortages and accustomed to being shut out by the FBI, was happy to comply. They filed a missing person report and forgot about it. The FBI's Philadelphia office launched an immediate internal investigation, but it was hamstrung from the beginning by the very thing Crawford had discovered. They didn't know who to trust. If the spy network extended into naval intelligence, could it extend into the Bureau itself? Morrison assigned his most trusted agents to search for Crawford, but their efforts were conducted in a vacuum of paranoia and second-guessing. They interviewed everyone who had been at Reading Terminal Station that evening. The newsboy, Jimmy Delacroix, proved to be a remarkably observant witness. He described the taller man in the fedora as having a fancy way of talking, like he'd been to college, and noted that the man had carried a leather briefcase. When shown photographs, Jimmy couldn't make a positive identification, but he said one photo looked kind of like him. The photo was of Harrison Aldrich III. The FBI brought Aldrich in for questioning on October 23rd, 4 days after Crawford's disappearance. Aldrich arrived at the federal building with 3 lawyers, a posture of offended dignity, and a complete alibi. He had been at a Union League dinner on the evening of October 19th, surrounded by 40 witnesses, including a federal judge and 2 state senators. The dinner had lasted from 6 p.m. until nearly midnight. There was no possibility he had been at Reading Terminal Station. Otto Becker was also questioned, in a basement interrogation room that smelled of sweat and fear. He denied everything. He denied knowing Crawford, denied visiting the cemetery, denied any involvement in espionage. When confronted with the fact that he'd been under FBI surveillance, he demanded a lawyer and stopped talking entirely. Without physical evidence, without the documents from the dead drop or Crawford's missing case file, the FBI had nothing to hold him on. Both men were released after 48 hours. Morrison knew this was a mistake, knew that releasing them would allow the spy ring to collapse their operation and disappear. But he had no choice. Attorney refused to prosecute without hard evidence, and everything Crawford had gathered had disappeared with him. The investigation into the spy network effectively died with Crawford's disappearance. The FBI kept the case open, technically, but the truth was that, without Crawford's methodical documentation, without his case file, without his testimony, they had nothing. The destroyers had been sunk, Crawford was gone, and whoever had orchestrated it all had won. In November 1944, 2 more destroyers left Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. This time, they reached their destination safely. Whatever the spy network had been doing, they had stopped, or moved on to other targets, other cities, other opportunities to bleed America's war effort. Margaret Crawford received her husband's final paycheck, and a letter from J. Edgar Hoover expressing his deepest regrets and his absolute confidence that Special Agent Crawford had died in the service of his country. The letter was classified confidential and came with implicit instructions not to discuss her husband's work with anyone, including family members. She was told that Thomas Crawford's name would appear on the FBI's memorial wall in Washington, but the circumstances of his death would remain sealed. She raised their daughter alone, working as a secretary at the University of Pennsylvania, living in the same row house on Fitzwater Street, keeping the marble steps scrubbed every Saturday morning. She never remarried. Every October 19th, for 42 years until her own death in 1986, she placed a single white rose on the steps where her husband had last walked out the door. The official story, the one that appeared in FBI internal documents, and the one told to new agents as a cautionary tale about the dangers of counterintelligence work, was that Crawford had been killed by the spy network he was investigating, and his body disposed of in such a way that it would never be found. The Delaware River was suggested as the most likely location, though no evidence supported this beyond the cold logic that it was the easiest way to make a body disappear in Philadelphia. But there was another story, one that was never written down, never officially acknowledged, but that circulated in whispers among the senior agents who had worked the case. This version suggested that Crawford's disappearance was not the work of Nazi spies, but something far more disturbing, a cover-up orchestrated from within the Bureau itself. The foundation for this theory was simple. How had Crawford's office been cleaned out so thoroughly and so quickly? The FBI's Philadelphia field office was in a secure building. The office itself required a key that only Crawford and two other agents possessed. Yet between 7:30 p.m., when Crawford left for the train station, and 11 p.m. when Morrison arrived to check on him, someone had entered that office and removed every scrap of evidence Crawford had compiled. The security guard on duty that night, a former Philadelphia cop named Daniel Sullivan, reported nothing unusual. No unauthorized persons had entered the building. No one had signed in to access Crawford's floor after business hours. Yet the office had been emptied. Either the guard was lying, or whoever cleaned out the office had authorized access, which meant they were FBI. Special Agent in charge Walter Morrison retired from the Bureau in 1948, 4 years after Crawford's disappearance. He moved to a small town in Maine and refused to speak about his time in Philadelphia. When contacted by true crime writers and historians in later years, he would only say that the Crawford case was complicated and that not everything that seems like betrayal is betrayal. He died in 1979, taking whatever he knew to his grave. Harrison Aldrich III continued his successful career in shipbuilding. Cramp Shipbuilding Company prospered during the war years, building destroyers, cruisers, and support vessels. Aldrich retired in 1958 and died in 1972 at his winter home in Palm Beach, surrounded by children and grandchildren. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer ran for 2 full columns, listing his many philanthropic contributions and business achievements. There was no mention of FBI investigations or missing agents. Otto Becker worked at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard until 1946, when the facility scaled down its operations after the war. He retired on a modest pension and died in 1959. His death certificate listed heart failure as the cause. He left no diary, no confessional letter, nothing to illuminate whether he had been part of a spy network or simply a loyal worker caught in the paranoid crosshairs of wartime security. The cemetery at St. Mark's Episcopal Church remained unchanged for decades. The angel monument marking the Aldrich family plot stood watch over the dead, its marble face worn smooth by Philadelphia's weather, its secrets, if there had ever been any, locked forever in stone. The case might have remained permanently cold, a footnote in FBI history, except for an event that occurred in 2022, 78 years after Crawford's disappearance. A construction crew working to renovate an old warehouse on Delaware Avenue, near the northern edge of what had been the Naval Shipyard, discovered something unusual during demolition. The building had been erected in 1938 and had served various purposes over the decades. Wartime storage, a furniture factory in the 1950s, a disco in the 1970s, and finally abandoned in the 1990s. When workers began tearing down an interior wall, they found a hollow space that shouldn't have existed according to the building's plans. Inside the hollow space was a metal box, approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 8 inches deep. It was rusted but intact, sealed with a padlock that had corroded beyond function. The construction foreman, a man named Mike Torres who watched a lot of true crime documentaries, had the presence of mind to call the police rather than opening it himself. Philadelphia Police Detective Sarah Chen responded to the call. She was a 20-year veteran of the department's cold case unit, a specialist in cases from the 1940s through 1970s, when record-keeping was spotty and forensic science was primitive by modern standards. When she saw the box, something in her instincts told her this was important. The box was transported to the police forensics lab and opened under controlled conditions. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from decades of humidity, were documents. Lots of documents. The first item removed was a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting in faded black ink. The name embossed on the notebook's cover was T. Crawford. What followed was one of the most intensive cold case investigations in Philadelphia's history. The notebook was Thomas Crawford's personal case file, the duplicate he'd kept separately from his office records, perhaps out of paranoia or simply good tradecraft. It documented everything. His surveillance of Otto Becker, the dead drop at St. Mark's Cemetery, Harrison Aldrich's involvement, and most critically his theory about how the spy network operated. Crawford's notes revealed a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple espionage. The network didn't just collect information, it manipulated it. They fed false intelligence to the Germans about ship production numbers, making it seem like fewer vessels were being built than actually were. This deception was designed to draw U-boats closer to the coast, where American destroyer escorts were waiting in wolf packs of their own. The 3 destroyers that were sunk weren't accidents or intelligence failures. They were bait. Crawford had discovered that a joint FBI naval intelligence operation had deliberately leaked the sailing information for those 3 ships, knowing the U-boats would attack, calculating that the sacrifice of 3 destroyers and their crews was worth the opportunity to sink multiple U-boats in pre-arranged kill zones. But something had gone wrong. The U-boats were more careful than anticipated, and the American destroyer escorts didn't arrive in time. 3 ships went down, nearly 1,000 men died, and the U-boats escaped. The operation was a catastrophic failure, and Crawford had learned about it through his investigation of the spy network. His notes revealed that Harrison Aldrich III wasn't a Nazi spy. He was an FBI asset, part of the deception operation, deliberately playing the role of a compromised executive to feed false information to the Germans. Otto Becker was similarly working for American intelligence, serving as a controlled conduit between the Shipyard and the Nazi spy network that the FBI had been manipulating for months. Crawford's final entry in the notebook, dated October 19, 1944, was chilling in its brevity. "They're using traitors to catch traitors and sailors are dying for it. This is wrong. Morrison knows, going to sack Morrison tonight to demand this operation be shut down, and the families told the truth. God help me if I'm wrong about being able to trust him." The implications were devastating. Special Agent in charge Walter Morrison had been running a sanctioned deception operation, using real spy networks as unwitting tools, sacrificing American lives for strategic advantage. When Crawford discovered the truth and threatened to expose it, Morrison had made a decision. Crawford was a security risk who could compromise an ongoing intelligence operation. The other documents in the box supported this theory. There were surveillance photographs of Morrison meeting with naval intelligence officers, typed memos outlining the deception operation's parameters, and most damning of all, a carbon copy of an order from FBI headquarters authorizing extreme measures to maintain operational security regarding the Philadelphia Shipyard investigation. The Philadelphia Police Department, working with the FBI's modern cold case division, pieced together what they believed happened on October 19, 1944. Crawford had been intercepted at Reading Terminal Station, not by Nazi spies but by fellow FBI agents acting on Morrison's orders. He'd been taken to a secure location, possibly the very warehouse where his notebook was later hidden, interrogated about what he'd told his wife or anyone else, and then killed. His body had almost certainly been disposed of in the Delaware River, but not immediately. The timing suggested that he was held for at least 24 hours, while his office was sanitized and a cover story prepared. The decision to make him simply disappear rather than stage an accident was coldly practical. A disappearance could be blamed on enemy action and would justify shutting down the investigation into the spy network without exposing the deception operation. Walter Morrison had cleaned out Crawford's office himself, or supervised its cleaning. The security guard, Daniel Sullivan, had been told to log nothing for that evening, or his logs had been altered afterward. The report Crawford intended to deliver had been destroyed. The only thing Morrison hadn't known about was Crawford's duplicate notebook, hidden away in a warehouse that Crawford had apparently used as a personal dead drop for his most sensitive materials. In 2023, the FBI officially reopened the Crawford case and conducted an internal review. By this point, everyone directly involved was long dead. Morrison, Aldrich, Becker, all were beyond the reach of justice. The review concluded that Crawford had likely been killed to protect a classified wartime operation, and that while this action violated both Bureau protocols and federal law, the circumstances of wartime security made prosecution impossible, even if anyone had survived to stand trial. The FBI issued a formal apology to Margaret Crawford's descendants, a granddaughter who lived in Seattle and had never known her grandfather. Thomas Crawford's name was added to the FBI's official memorial with a notation acknowledging that he had died investigating a counterintelligence operation. His status was changed from missing to killed in the line of duty. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard closed in 1995, a victim of post-Cold War defense cuts. The site was slowly redeveloped into commercial and residential properties. The grave at St. Mark's Episcopal Church still stands, though the Aldrich family has no living descendants in Philadelphia. The cemetery is now a quiet tourist attraction, its historical markers noting the prominent families buried there, with no mention of the intelligence tradecraft that once occurred in its shadows. The three destroyers, USS Benson, USS Harlan, and USS McKinley, remain at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, officially listed as war losses due to enemy action. The families of the nearly 1,000 men who died on those ships were never told that their loved ones' deaths were part of a calculated intelligence operation. The Navy's official histories of World War II make no mention of the Philadelphia deception operation or the destroyers used as bait. In 2024, a documentary filmmaker named Rachel Schwartz produced a film about the Crawford case titled The Spy Who Wasn't. The documentary used the recovered notebook, interviews with intelligence historians, and declassified wartime documents to reconstruct the events of autumn 1944. It argued that Crawford had been a whistleblower, killed not by enemy spies but by his own government for threatening to expose an operation that violated every principle of justice and transparency he had sworn to uphold. The film sparked renewed interest in wartime intelligence operations and the moral calculations that governments make during existential conflicts. Had the deception operation worked as planned, had the U-boats been destroyed and the spy network successfully manipulated, would Crawford's death have been justified? If saving American lives in the aggregate required sacrificing some lives specifically, who got to make that decision? These were questions that echoed across the decades, unanswerable but essential. Thomas Crawford's story became a case study at the FBI Academy, taught to new agents as an example of the moral complexities of intelligence work. The lesson was nuanced. Crawford had been right to question the operation, but he had also violated the chain of command by threatening to go over his supervisor's head. Morrison had been following orders from Washington, but he had also made the decision to eliminate a colleague rather than risk exposure. There was no clean resolution, no satisfying answer to who had been right and who had been wrong. This was the nature of intelligence work during wartime, a realm where patriotism and murder could inhabit the same decision, where the line between hero and traitor could shift depending on which side of the classified briefing you sat on. For the people of Philadelphia, the revelation that one of their city's most prominent families had been secretly working for American intelligence, while appearing to collaborate with Nazis, was met with a complex mix of pride and unease. The Aldrich name, which had adorned buildings and endowments for generations, now carried an asterisk in the city's historical memory. Patriot or actor, hero or manipulator, depending on who told the story. The neighborhood where Crawford had lived, Fitzwater Street in South Philadelphia, has gentrified significantly since the 1940s. The row houses that were once home to working-class Irish and Italian families now sell for $500,000 to young professionals. But the tradition of scrubbing the marble steps every Saturday morning persists, passed down through generations who don't remember why they do it, only that it's what their mothers and grandmothers did. In October 2024, 80 years to the day after Thomas Crawford walked out of the federal building and vanished, the FBI held a memorial ceremony at its Philadelphia field office. Crawford's granddaughter attended, along with representatives from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Philadelphia Police Department, and a handful of very elderly veterans who had served on destroyers built at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. A plaque was unveiled, bronze on black marble, bearing Crawford's name and dates, and a simple inscription: "He sought the truth and paid the ultimate price." The ceremony was brief, dignified and carefully worded to avoid the uncomfortable questions that lingered beneath the surface. The naval veterans in attendance knew something that wasn't spoken aloud at the ceremony, something that added another layer of tragedy to Crawford's story. In the years following the war, declassified German naval records revealed that U-boat 482, which had sunk 2 of the 3 destroyers, had been operating with intelligence that was far more detailed than even the FBI had suspected. The U-boat's captain, Oberleutnant Hartmut Graf, had been interrogated by British intelligence after his capture in 1945. Graf's testimony, sealed for 50 years and only released in 1995, indicated that his intelligence hadn't come through traditional spy networks at all. It had been provided by a source within the Kriegsmarine's intelligence division who had somehow penetrated American naval communications at a level that suggested either a highly placed mole or a catastrophic security breach in the Navy's encryption systems. The Philadelphia spy network that Crawford investigated may have been a sideshow, a distraction, while the real leak was happening somewhere else entirely. This revelation cast Crawford's death in an even darker light. If the spy network he'd been investigating wasn't the primary source of the intelligence leak, then the deception operation Morrison ran was based on a false premise. The 3 destroyers hadn't been sacrificed to draw U-boats into a trap. They'd been lost because of an entirely different security failure that the FBI and naval intelligence either didn't know about or were covering up for different reasons. Some intelligence historians argued that this made Crawford's death even more unjust. He'd been killed to protect an operation that was itself built on incomplete or inaccurate intelligence assessments. Others maintained that Crawford still had to be silenced because, right or wrong about the spy network, he knew about the deception operation and threatened to expose it at a critical point in the war. The warehouse on Delaware Avenue, where Crawford's notebook was discovered, was demolished in 2023 after the documents were recovered. The site is now a luxury apartment building, with a Riverview gym and artisan coffee shop on the ground floor. There's a small historical marker near the entrance that mentions the building's wartime use as a storage facility, but nothing about what was found in its walls or the FBI agent whose secrets had been sealed there for nearly 8 decades. The question of who actually sealed Crawford's notebook in that wall remains unanswered. The most plausible theory is that Crawford himself did it, creating insurance policy in case his confrontation with Morrison went badly. He would have placed the notebook there sometime between October 18th and October 19th, perhaps during lunch or on his way to work. The warehouse was only a few blocks from the federal building, and Crawford had investigated cases there during his time in Philadelphia. He would have known the building's layout and vulnerabilities. If this theory is correct, then Crawford walked into that meeting with Morrison knowing he might not walk out. He'd prepared for his own disappearance, left a record of the truth, and trusted that someday somehow it would be found. That level of foresight suggested either paranoia or a deep understanding of how intelligence services operated when threatened. Given Crawford's 3 years in counterintelligence work, it was probably the latter. Margaret Crawford died in 1986 without ever knowing what happened to her husband. Her daughter Claire grew up with only the vaguest memories of a father who worked late and smelled of cigarette smoke and Old Spice cologne. Claire married, moved to Seattle, and had children of her own. She visited Philadelphia only twice after her mother's funeral, and both times she avoided Fitzwater Street, unable to face the house where her father had kissed her goodnight for the last time on October 18, 1944. Claire's daughter, Crawford's granddaughter, was named Margaret after the grandmother she barely knew. Young Margaret grew up hearing fragments of family history, the story of a grandfather who worked for the FBI and disappeared during the war. When the notebook was discovered in 2022, she was the one who authorized the FBI to examine it, who agreed to DNA testing to confirm the handwriting, who decided that the truth, however painful, was better than the silence that had haunted her family for 3 generations. At the 2024 memorial ceremony, Margaret spoke briefly about what it meant to finally know how her grandfather died. "I used to think the hardest part was not knowing," she said, her voice amplified by microphones in the FBI building's courtyard. "But knowing is harder. Knowing that he was killed by the people he trusted, by the institution he served, for trying to do the right thing. That's a different kind of pain. But at least it's a pain with a name, with a story. My grandmother lived 50 years with ghosts and questions. I can live with answers, even terrible ones." The FBI's official position, articulated at that ceremony and in subsequent statements, was carefully calibrated. Yes, Crawford had been killed by fellow agents. Yes, this was done to protect a classified operation. Yes, this constituted murder under any definition of the law. But context mattered. The nation was at war. Security protocols from that era were different, and everyone involved had believed they were acting in the national interest. No one would be prosecuted. No pensions would be revoked from dead men's estates. No one's reputation would be officially tarnished beyond the acknowledgement of basic facts. The case was closed again, this time permanently, with the notation that justice had been served through truth-telling, even if no punishment was possible. Detective Sarah Chen, who had overseen the investigation of the recovered notebook, retired from the Philadelphia Police Department in 2024, shortly after the case was concluded. In interviews afterward, she expressed frustration with the outcome. "We solved the murder," she said. "We know who did it, we know why, we have documentary evidence. In any other case, this would be a prosecutor's dream. But because it involves the FBI and national security and events from 80 years ago, nobody gets held accountable. The family gets an apology and a plaque. Thomas Crawford gets his name cleared. But the system that killed him, that doesn't change." She had a point. The structures that allowed Crawford's murder, the secrecy, the prioritization of operational security over individual rights, the belief that national interest could justify any action, those structures remained intact. Intelligence agencies still operated in shadows, still made calculations about acceptable losses, still protected their own when institutional reputation was threatened. The Crawford case did prompt some reforms, mostly symbolic. The FBI updated its whistleblower protection policies, created an internal review board for allegations of misconduct in classified operations, and mandated ethics training that used Crawford's story as a cautionary tale. Whether these measures would prevent another Crawford-type situation or simply make it easier to justify was a question that divided opinions within the Bureau itself. Philadelphia's relationship with its World War II history evolved in the wake of the Crawford revelations. The city had always celebrated its role in the war effort. The shipyards, the factories, the men and women who built the arsenal of democracy. But now that history had a shadow, a reminder that not everyone who served had been celebrated, and not every death had been honored. The heroic narrative was complicated by uncomfortable truths about deception operations and sacrificed sailors and murdered investigators. Local historians debated whether to include Crawford's story in the World War II exhibit at the Philadelphia History Museum. Some argued that it was essential context for understanding the era's complexity. Others felt it was a distraction from the larger story of American sacrifice and victory. Eventually, a compromise was reached. A small section on intelligence and counterintelligence in wartime Philadelphia that mentioned Crawford's case alongside other espionage incidents presented with appropriate context and nuance. The St. Mark's Episcopal Church Cemetery became an unexpected tourist destination after the documentary film brought attention to Crawford's investigation. The church, uncertain how to respond to people who came specifically to see the Aldrich grave and its role in the spy story, eventually installed a small informational plaque. It read, "This cemetery was the site of intelligence activities during World War II. While we cannot confirm all details of these operations, we honor the memory of those who served their country in difficult circumstances, regardless of which side of secrecy they stood on." Otto Becker's descendants, tracked down by genealogy enthusiasts following the case, maintained that their grandfather had been a loyal American who was falsely accused by paranoid FBI agents. They pointed out that he'd never been charged with any crime, never confessed to anything, and lived out his life peacefully until his death in 1959. The recovered documents suggested Becker had been a controlled asset working for American intelligence, but this was never definitively proven, and the Becker family preferred to believe their grandfather had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Aldrich family's response was more complicated. Harrison Aldrich III's great-grandchildren, who still carried the name but lived far from Philadelphia, issued a statement through lawyers acknowledging their ancestors' role in the deception operation. They framed it as patriotic service, noting that Aldrich had put himself at considerable personal and professional risk to aid his country. Whether he knew about Crawford's fate or participated in the cover-up remained unclear from the documentary record, and his descendants chose to give him the benefit of the doubt. The three destroyers that sank in October 1944 became the focus of renewed interest from maritime historians and wreck divers. The exact locations of U.S. Benson and USS Harlan had been documented when they sank, but USS McKinley's position was less certain. In 2023, a privately funded expedition located and photographed McKinley's wreck, lying in 380 feet of water about 230 miles east of Atlantic City. The images showed a ship broken in half, its bow section collapsed, but its stern relatively intact, encrusted with decades of marine growth. The expedition's leader, a marine archaeologist named Dr. James Walsh, proposed declaring all three wrecks as war graves under the Sunken Military Craft Act, which would protect them from disturbance and artifact recovery. The proposal was approved in 2024, meaning the destroyers and the nearly 1,000 men who went down with them would remain undisturbed on the ocean floor, a permanent memorial to a sacrifice that was more complicated than anyone had known. In the decades since World War II, the question of acceptable sacrifice in warfare has been debated countless times. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the saturation bombing of German cities, the naval blockades that starved civilian populations, all of these raised ethical questions about means and ends, about whether total war justified any tactic that shortened the conflict. The Crawford case fit into this larger debate, though on a smaller, more personal scale. What made Crawford's story particularly haunting was its intimacy. This wasn't about destroying an enemy city or sinking a hostile fleet. This was about one American killing another American, not in the heat of battle or even in the fog of war, but coldly and deliberately, with planning and cover-up, to protect an operation that may or may not have been worth protecting. It was bureaucratic murder, the kind that happens in offices and warehouses, documented in triplicate and filed away in classified archives. The philosophical question at the heart of the case was never really answered. Had Walter Morrison been right to eliminate Crawford? If the deception operation had succeeded? If U-boats had been lured into traps and destroyed? If the intelligence victory had been achieved? Would Crawford's death have been a tragic but necessary sacrifice? And if the operation had been built on faulty intelligence? If the destroyers had been lost for nothing? Did that make Crawford's death a murder rather than an operational casualty? These questions had no objective answers. They depended on unprovable counterfactuals, on what might have happened in alternative versions of history that were forever inaccessible. What could be said with certainty was that Thomas Crawford had tried to do what he thought was right, had been killed for it, and had left behind a wife and daughter who carried the weight of his absence for the rest of their lives. The row house on Fitzwater Street changed hands multiple times after Margaret Crawford's death. Each new owner learned the history eventually. Philadelphia is a city that remembers its stories, especially ones involving murder and mystery and federal agents. Some owners embraced the notoriety, telling guests about the FBI agent who'd lived there. Others found it unsettling, a shadow that couldn't quite be exorcised even with new paint and renovated kitchens. The current owner, a software engineer named David Park, who bought the house in 2019, researched Crawford extensively after learning about the connection. He found Margaret Crawford's old scrapbook at an estate sale, filled with newspaper clippings about the war, photographs of Thomas in his FBI credentials photo looking stern and official, and Claire's elementary school drawings of a house with 3 stick figures labeled Mommy, Daddy, Me. Park donated the scrapbook to the Philadelphia History Museum, where it now resides in the archives, available to researchers who want to understand the human cost of history. The federal building where Crawford worked, the one on 9th and Market Street where he maintained his secret office, was demolished in 1987 and replaced with a modern glass tower. Nothing remains of the spaces where Crawford documented his investigation, where he drafted his final report, where he made the decision to confront his superior rather than let the deception continue. The institutional memory was erased along with the building, replaced by the sleek anonymity of contemporary architecture. Reading Terminal Station, where Crawford was last seen alive, still operates as a commuter rail hub, though it's been renovated repeatedly over the decades. The men's washroom, where he might have been intercepted, has been relocated and redesigned so many times that its 1944 location is impossible to determine with certainty. Thousands of people pass through the station every day, none of them aware that somewhere in that space 80 years ago, an FBI agent vanished and a cover-up began. The newsboy who witnessed Crawford's last moments, Jimmy Delacroix, lived until 2019, dying at age 91 in a nursing home in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. In his final years, suffering from dementia, he sometimes spoke about the man in the coat who disappeared at the train station. His family thought these were confused memories, fragmented dreams, until after his death, when they learned about the Crawford case and realized their grandfather had been a witness to history. Special Agent in charge Walter Morrison left behind no personal papers, no diary, no explanation for his actions in October 1944. His family insisted he'd been a devoted public servant who never spoke about his work, maintaining operational security even in retirement. The one time he was directly asked about Crawford, in 1971, by a journalist researching a book about FBI history, Morrison refused to comment beyond saying, "Every decision I made was approved by Washington. That's all I'll say about it." Whether Washington had specifically approved Crawford's elimination or whether Morrison had acted on his own authority within broader operational parameters was never determined. The relevant documents, if they ever existed, remained classified or had been destroyed. The FBI's 2023 internal review concluded that definitive attribution of command responsibility is not possible given the passage of time and the destruction of relevant classified materials in accordance with records retention policies. This bureaucratic language, translated to a simple truth, no one would ever know for certain whether Morrison had acted as a rogue supervisor or as a faithful executor of orders from above. The ambiguity was convenient for the FBI's institutional reputation, allowing them to condemn the action without implicating the organization's leadership, to offer sympathy to Crawford's family without acknowledging systemic culpability. In the end, the Crawford case became what most cold cases eventually become: a story, a lesson, a data point in the larger history of crime and punishment and justice deferred. The facts were established, the truth revealed, and then archived. Life moved on. Philadelphia remained Philadelphia, a city of neighborhoods and history and secrets, where every block held stories that would never fully be told. For those who study intelligence history, Crawford's name appears in footnotes and specialized monographs, cited as an example of the tensions between individual conscience and institutional imperatives. For the FBI, he's a reminder of the costs of secrecy, honored but not celebrated, remembered but not emulated. For his family, he's a grandfather and father and husband who was taken too soon for reasons that, even explained, never quite made sense. The story of Thomas Crawford and the Philadelphia spy network of 1944 is ultimately a story about the price of truth. Crawford paid with his life for seeking it. His wife paid with decades of uncertainty. His daughter paid with the loss of a father she barely knew. His granddaughter paid with the burden of a family mystery that became a family tragedy. And the bureau that he served paid with the revelation that not all of its agents were killed by enemies. Some were killed by each other. There's a final detail worth noting, discovered in Crawford's notebook, but not widely publicized. On the last page, after his final entry about confronting Morrison, Crawford had written something that was clearly not part of his investigative notes. It was a message, perhaps to himself, perhaps to anyone who might someday read his words. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. Don't let anyone tell you I was paranoid or crazy, or that I didn't understand the bigger picture. I understood perfectly. I understood that we were using traitors to catch traitors, that we were feeding men to U-boats like bait, that we were willing to let sailors die to protect an intelligence operation. I understood that this is what war demands, that hard men make hard choices, that the end sometimes justifies terrible means. I understood all of it. I just didn't agree. And if that made me a security risk, if that made me expendable, then I guess I was. But I go down knowing I was right about what matters. Every life matters. Every sailor on those ships mattered, and truth matters more than operational success. They can kill me, but they can't change that. These words, more than any official report or memorial plaque or documentary film, captured who Thomas Crawford had been. A man who understood the game but refused to accept its rules, who saw the machine of war and intelligence clearly and decided that some prices were too high to pay, even for victory. Whether he was naive or principled, foolish or heroic, depends on where you stand on the eternal question of what we owe to individuals versus what we owe to the collective. There's no objective answer. There never is in cases like this, where good people disagree about fundamental values, where the stakes are measured in lives, and the choices are all terrible. What we can say, 80 years later, is that Thomas Crawford tried to do what he thought was right. He followed the evidence, documented the truth, and stood up to power when power demanded his silence. He lost, but his story survived, sealed in a wall, waiting for the day when it could finally be told. And in that survival, perhaps, there's a kind of victory after all.